Good morning. Welcome to our Bible class today. We're studying Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. What's the darkest place you have ever been? Perhaps like me, you've gone to New Mexico's Carlsbad Caverns. The caverns have this room in it. It's called the Great Room. And when you descend into the bowels of the caverns, you come into that room, and the park ranger has a demonstration. He flips a switch, and with it, the artificial lights go out, leaving a room that is darker than is imaginable. You literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. In the physical world, we experience all kinds of darkness, but mostly we meet it in varying degrees and various shades of darkness. It's mostly dark, it's some dark, it's some light. Yet, the way you deal with darkness is always the same. You turn on a light. In this lesson, we want to think about those two elements, light and darkness. Light is the very foundation of creation. In Genesis chapter 1, Moses wrote that the world was without form and void, and darkness moved on the face of the waters. But in the darkness, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. The antidote to darkness is light. It's the fundamental element of all of God's creation. And so in this lesson, we are going to meet a central idea of the book of Ephesians. The church exists to be light to show the darkness of the world. So let's turn on the light and experience the darkness. Our lesson begins at the conclusion of last week's class, which provides kind of a bridge to this lesson. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. Every child understands the idea behind that passage. When they want to pester a brother or a sister, they mimic everything down to the nth detail. Every word, every gesture, every look of the eye, just to irritate them. But you see, one of the ways we learn as people is to imitate, to mimic someone else. It's how we learn how to walk. It's how we learn how to talk. It's how we learn everything. And that term mimic is what comes up in this passage. We are to look at God and mimic Him in our lives. For us, that may seem absurd. After all, we would say, we're not God. How can I imitate God because I'm not God? And yet, it has to do with the way our last class ended, the end of Ephesians chapter 4. Verse 32 said, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." Our treatment of our brethren should take the tenor of God's action with us. We forgive as God forgave us. We are kind to others as God has been kind to us. Our actions are tender-hearted and compassionate because that's how God deals with us. And the basic premise of the church's action and its members is that we are the mirror of God. If the world sees the church, it sees the God they serve. And yet, for many people, their lives are more like a carnival mirror that distorts the image. So instead of seeing God, they see a twisted vision of God. Now, no wonder the world is confused by what it sees. And the best yardstick of daily living is very simple. Would I like it if God treated me the way I'm treating other people? Now, this arises not just to end a passage, but as a transition to another piece, the one we will see at this passage. For the third time in 35 verses, we come across the key word of the last half of the book of Ephesians. The word is walk. And walk in love, as Christ loved us and gave Himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. The daily life of Christ was to exude the same love that Christ had for us. Verse 2 shows what kind of love Christ had and the type of love we too must offer. There's where the mimicking comes. He speaks of two things, an offering and a sacrifice. Now in the Old Testament, we meet both of these phrases. The offering was something given from the fields. For instance, wheat grown by a farmer was given as a food offering, as a grain offering. It was not uncommon for that to happen. It was specified in the Levitical law. However, the sacrifice was one that had the blood in it. It was a lamb that was slaughtered, a bull that was put on the altar. It was a living thing that had given his life. It is both gift and giver, all at the same time. Now we see this most clearly in the story of Cain and Abel, for both are there. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. Cain brought an offering. Abel brought a sacrifice. And it was not what was given that was the issue in Genesis chapter 4, but how it was given. That's a whole different class. But together these two terms describe the sum of all the giving of self of the sacrificial system of the Mosaic law. In short, Jesus gave all that he had, all the sacrifices, all the gift available. But Paul adds something. He says that was a fragrant offering. In Exodus, we read the same concept about the sacrifices God instructed. Then you shall cut the ram into pieces and wash its entrails and its legs and put them with its pieces and its head and burn the whole ram on the altar. It is a burnt offering to the Lord. It is a pleasing aroma of food offering to the Lord. You hear all of those pieces there? Sacrifice, offering, pleasing aroma. All are the same things in Ephesians chapter 5. The emphasis is not on the aroma or the odor or the smell. It's the symbolic word for what is pleasing and what is pleasant. How do you respond when you're hungry and you get a whiff of chocolate chip cookies baking in the oven? Doesn't that make you feel good? Isn't that something you want? It's that figure that is the offering that God saw as acceptable. It fit with his commands, and it came from an attitude of gratitude. It made God happy. Everything that Christ did pleased God. Every sacrifice he made pleased God. Now our lives have to exhibit that same kind of care, concern, and love that flows out of the heart that gives itself. That's the challenge for people who tend to seek their own way, and that means all of us. And so in this verse, Jesus shows us the way. But what Christ does and what we are commanded to be stands in contrast to the environment of the Ephesians, for they lived in a very dark world. One of the prized possessions of Ephesus was the great temple of Diana. It was massive and exquisite. Today there are just a few ruins that remain, but it's been reproduced on a full-scale model. It served the Greek goddess Aphrodite, or Diana, as the Romans called her. She was the goddess of love, sensuality, and eroticism. The worship of Diana came in the form of a drunken orgy, in which men and women both engaged in unspeakable acts of immorality. Yet, this was under the umbrella of religion, and so not became just accepted, but expected of everyone who lived there. I find it fascinating that all cultures, when business or commerce are threatened, everything that threatens them can be easily dismissed or attacked. In Acts 19, for instance, Paul faced the angry silversmiths of Ephesus because his preaching of Christ had caused people to forsake Diana, and their commercial venture was collapsing. Paul knew quite well what the temple of Diana was like, and what the people who served it were like, and what was going on there. It is no wonder then that Paul must write this section, for it is so pervasive. Old ideas die slow deaths. And when you've hooked your spiritual life to immorality, something pleasurable and enjoyable, it's harder to break the bonds. And yet, through a series of verses, Paul describes the degradation that must never mark the life of a Christian. He begins the ugly journey in verse 3. But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. Those words, sexual immorality, impurity, covetousness, all just drip with filth. Sexual immorality is any sexual perversion that can be named all the way from adultery and fornication to things that are far more repulsive. There was a Greek whose name was Solon, who introduced prostitution into Athens. He built brothels there that became the ancient Las Vegas, and soon the lucrative trade came to Ephesus, where it became institutionalized in the temple of Diana, and when that happened, it became legitimized wickedness. Now, today we feel surrounded by all kinds of things through like pornography and slackening of the moral climate, but that's mild compared to the Ephesians. They couldn't go anywhere without being propositioned by a prostitute, homosexual or heterosexual. It was that bad. Your children would encounter it every day, and you had no choice. It was through the whole culture. But Paul paired the physical act of immorality with a spiritual motivation called covetousness. See, covetousness is a wantonness. It is a desire run amok and out of control. It wants to have without considering or caring about any consequences. Covetousness is an animalistic pursuit. I want what I want when I want it now. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who it hurts. I want it. But Paul says that does not fit the Christian lifestyle. It's like a child's finger painting hanging in the Louvre. Immorality in a Christian's life is like a giraffe in the Kentucky Derby. It just doesn't belong there. Yet, it goes on beyond even those things. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead, let there be thanksgiving. Now, he comes back around to speech again. He's done that a couple of times in this last half of Ephesians. But this time, the focus is on humor and jesting and the kinds of talk that just kind of roll out of your mouth. Now, one interesting question, I think, is where does humor come from? The truth is that humor it just arises from the top of your mind. Unless you're a professional comedian who must write jokes for a living, most humor, most witty things just fall off the mind. It sees something, and it becomes a clever turn. When the mindset is on the flesh, the first joke source is always something crude, dirty, and demeaning. It's junior high body humor, if you will. It's that kind of joke, where your mind is thinking about that. Now, when we listen to jokes today, many of them are nothing more than a reflection of society. Most humor, by the way, reflects the society in which it is told. And if you look at humor today, and even back then, it tends to dwell in the sewer of life, drudging up all the slop and making the turn of a phrase interesting and funny. But the more you make fun of something, the less likely you'll take it seriously, which is part of the problem. It avoids taking responsibility. It refuses to make it serious. Now, that term crude joking was applied to Ephesian orators who could say outrageous things. And then, when held accountable, they say, well, what's the matter? Can't you take a joke? See, it's a way to dodge responsibility by those whose minds are perverted. If a man tells a joke or a woman tells a joke, and then they say, didn't you understand I was just joking? It wasn't a joke. It was crude jesting, which is a whole different matter. Again, Paul condemns the idea of how out of place it is for either a society or for a Christian. He says it's not proper, but it still occurs, and it just shows how tangled the current climate is with Christian belief and living. Paul's remedy is to contrast that with thanksgiving. Instead of see the world's darkness, a Christian sees God's blessings and the good of the world, not the smutty ones. And usually our minds only see what our eyes only see what our minds are attuned to. It's kind of like old radios and cars. You take a long trip, for instance, and you'd be driving along and you'd have that old AM radio. And all it had was a dial, and you drive for a little while, and suddenly you get this crackle of static as it's beginning to lose its signal. So you have to start turning the dial until you can find a station where you liked what was on it. That's what's happening, as Paul describes it. People who tune their mind to God's good see something different than people who dial it in to something terribly ugly. Depravity comes from the latter, while thanksgiving comes from the first. So when Paul writes this, it's not because he's just a puritanical prude. It's because when you look beyond today, the current life, wherever you are, consequences flow from that. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or who is covetous, that is, an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. All of what was incorporated into the daily life of Ephesus, or America, will face the wrath and judgment of God, will be judged, will be excluded to the eternal garbage dump where it belongs. But here he adds one more term, the term idolater, to that list because it describes a different facet of that problem. It's not just worshiping an idol. That's what we think. It's not just about the behavior and the thirst for more. When you worship something as your God, you are an idolater. When you give your whole self to something, you have crossed the line. There are people who give their whole lives to pleasing themselves. They give their whole lives to pleasure, to doing what feels best, not what is right. Now, we usually like to stop and just wag our finger at immorality as something evil, wrong, and perverse. But that's not Paul's actual point. Yes, it's easy to condemn immorality. It's another thing to peel it back to find out what it really means. One of the great truths of humanity is that life tends to be only what we see, and we judge what we see, and we never ask any more questions. But beneath the surface, there is something going on. It is what is driving what we're doing. Behavior always has a value that prompts it to happen. No one does anything without a deeper reason. So what is this? It's a contrast to lifestyles. Remember back in verse 2, Paul spoke of sacrifice and giving. That was about yielding yourself for the good of others and the commandment of God. That's what Christians do. We mimic God, we imitate Christ. But when you get to verses 3 and 4, it's about self-gratification. I want to feel good. I deserve this. I want this. I am free to do as I please, and no one can tell me what to do. You hear the contrast between that? I will give because I believe in God. I will take because I believe in myself. And wrong choices come when you feel like you have complete freedom to do as you please. The real problem with immorality and sexual sin is what it reveals. It pulls back a curtain to a motive of self-satisfying at any cost. It's in this closing section that Paul reminds him of evil's shell game. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Those caught up in the immoral trade of Ephesus told people that was good, that was proper. It was even holy, they would say. in America, the debate over prostitution sometimes has come down over a single phrase. It's a victimless crime, people who advocate this. Is it? We've seen an explosion in this country of human trafficking, of taking teenage girls or boys and selling them much like cattle. It's far from victimless because it destroys all the parties involved in some way. It corrupts their soul and destroys their lives. And anybody who thinks that it's really innocent has deceived themselves or has been deceived. They've been tricked. See, sometimes in marriages, extramarital affairs are labeled as normal, and they leave people broken and feeling cheap and used, which that does. And God's punishment always flows to those who try to justify things away with their words. So the practical idea is expressed in verse 7. Therefore, do not become partners with them. Now, Paul doesn't tell them to move out of Ephesus, become a hermit in the desert, get away from this filthy society. Some men have tried that, and they've all failed because the problem was not with the society, it was what was going on here. Instead, he's telling them about the emotional and spiritual distance you have to take. Don't dabble, don't engage, don't approve. Now, to win the lost, we have to engage them. But to win the lost, we cannot become like the lost. Behavior and attitude must be so distinct that the world knows what a Christian is, and sadly, somehow, that line tends to have gotten blurred over recent years until you see angry Christians shaking a fist that look like angry looters carrying a TV set. When the lines are not clean and clear, the world never will get the message. It'll just assume it's a little bit more like they are. Now, when we apply the world's methods, we become partners with the world. That's what Paul is saying. Beware the preacher who tells you this is what works in the world. That's a handshake with the devil. So Paul turns his light off of the dark world and points to something else. Let's look at the light. So as Paul comes to the close of the lesson, he points out how far the Ephesians have come. And for the fourth time, he tells us how we ought to walk. For at one time you were in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. See, at one time, they fit all of those patterns in the first part of this lesson. He said, but now, you're not anything like that. So walk that way. They turned this corner. God had flipped up a switch in their lives when they became Christians. As with Him, conversion made them, their spiritual blindness fall as scale from their eyes, just as Paul had. Bathed in light. They're different. The image of light has so many facets, of which Paul attempts to convey many of them. First of all, light produces fruit. In verse 9, Paul says, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true, and tries to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. An apple tree produces apples. Light produces something else. And here are the things that it produces. What is good, what is right and true, and it tries to please the Lord. See, the triad of the first three words is the essence of God and His kingdom. What we do benefits others, not ourselves. Light seeks to do what God says to do and fully obey. And it sprouts the truth, the idea that something real and accurate and eternal in life. And no wonder when you examine the darkness, it seeks its own ways, no matter how vile it is to God, and uses deception to rationalize it. That's the fruit of darkness. The fruit of light is exactly the opposite. I think it's proverbial to say the nut doesn't fall far from the tree. And if you look at your life, you can see how much light is really there, because it will produce the fruit that people can see and experience. But the second thing light does is it exposes evil. When I was living on the Gulf Coast, we had roaches. Now, I don't mean those itty-bitty little things. I mean, they were big enough to ride. You could saddle those things up and ride them to town if you wanted to. And I had a 2-year-old who was fearless. She'd go around the house and smush roaches with her bare feet. Now, she's 38, and she's still just as fearless. But at night, I'd walk in the kitchen, I'd flip on the light, and if you live on the Gulf Coast, it's a common experience. These roaches scatter everywhere. And because the cover of darkness has been blown, the light showed them what they were, and so they're scattering to see if they can get back to the darkness, under the refrigerators, in small corners someplace where they can't be seen, where the light can't touch them. Paul kind of agrees with the roaches, frankly. Take no part in their unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. Paul wants Christians to turn on the light to show how dark the world really is. He wants us to put actions in a furnace and see how pure they are. The light will try them and show what genuine living is. That's what happens. It will expose the darkness that's in you. That's the reason really is the roach reason. Wickedness does not like to be exposed to light. Now, when I was growing up, the 10 p.m. news always started with this tagline. It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? Now, I think that's a great question because nothing good happens in the darkness of night. Just wake up, look at your tablet or your phone for what happened overnight in the latest local news, and all you're going to find and happens in the middle of the night is murder, rapes, and robberies. And they occur in those secret places, and even trysts happen in hideaways where nobody can see them. Light, they don't want to be exposed to light. They want it to hide in the secret dark corners of the world. That's where evil hides. So shame will never expose itself to examination. The Christian's not afraid of the light. He'll let all of his life show for what it is. A child of God, forgiven by God, living for God. But light also makes the hidden plain. Now you see things when you turn on the light, and that's almost a duh expression. Of course you do. When the light hits our eyes, we interpret what is there. When there is no sensory apparatus, when we can't see any light because there is none, we don't see anything. Now, sometimes at Christmas, I have to get up in the attic to haul down Christmas decorations. It's not the most pleasant of jobs, but I had to do this one thing. As I climb the stairs, there is just to my left a pull chain. Just before I get to the top, before I step off of the safety of the stairs into the attic, I went up and yanked that chain, and it turns on a naked electric light bulb that glows. Now I do that because it's dark up there, and I need to see the light for what I'm searching for. That's one of the functions of light. But when anything is exposed to the light, it becomes visible. For anything becomes visible is light. And therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. When the light is shown, people will see it. We live authentically as Christians for a reason. We're going to show people what you see is what you get. We have no ulterior motives. We have no skeletons in our closet. We can let our computers be searched or our lives examined because we want our life to be seen because it is light. Light lets the hidden be seen. So as Paul begins to close this section, he has an allusion to two Old Testament passages. Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 19 and Isaiah chapter 60 verse 1. Now many people assume that this is an early Christian hymn, much like that in Philippians chapter 2 verses 5 to 8. It's interesting that in several passages in the New Testament you can pick these things up and realize these are the things that were familiar to the church because they were singing them. Now think about that church. They sang about the light. Don't we do the same thing? We've just updated the words. Walking in sunlight all of my journey, over the mountains, through the deep vale, Jesus has said, I'll never forsake thee. Promise divine that never can fail. Heavenly sunlight, flooding my soul with glory divine. Hallelujah, I'm rejoicing, singing his praises. Jesus is mine. See, we're walking in the sunlight. Just as Paul told them, walk in the light. Now, Paul makes this dramatic contrast between a life engaged in the world or one immersed in Christ. This lesson is about that sharp, distinct difference. One life is full of darkness. It appeals to the sensual side of mankind, to the selfish part, to the part that wants to be satisfied. It sniffs the wind, seeking the satisfaction at all costs of self and others. We live in a world much like that today. It doesn't take a lot of exploration to find out how wicked our world is, even in what seems like civilized society. The degradation of our world is just so plain. Sexual immorality of all kinds. The free flow of sexual intercourse among those who are not married is there. The degradation of human bodies for the sake of pleasure in whatever form they come. But we're not the first to feel that. Paul knew. The Ephesians knew. But he says, on the other hand, even though that's around us, there is this glorious light, Christianity. It seeks to serve, to give, and to obey. It wants God above all other things that I want. It will put self aside for the good of the body, for the sake of God himself and the sake of obedience. It wants what God wants above what I want. And in the end, the interesting thing is we will genuinely get what we need by letting God having his way with us. The light is glorious, but living in the light is difficult. It's a difficult walk that the Ephesians had to do, and it's one that we must live in the same way. But it's not easy. This passage, I think, highlights one simple truth that is easily missed, and it's being missed on a regular basis today. The church does not exist to be comfortable. See, we have kind of decided in our own minds that the church needs society to change to make us comfortable. We want our Christianity not to be challenged, so we want the society around us to make it where we don't have to be challenged. We want a moral society not to have a moral society as much as it makes it easier for us. See, we want to be stroked and encouraged and praised by the culture. We like that phrase, a Christian nation. But at best, it's a fantasy. In reality, what this passage teaches is we live in a way that makes it uncomfortable to stay in the darkness. God wants us as light not to be comfortable, but to be confrontive. We want to expose the degradation of evil and the dead end of selfish living. And so he creates us as light to make the darkness so uncomfortable it wants to come to the light. Can we do that? Thank you for joining me this morning. I hope you've gotten something out of our lesson together, and I'll be back with you again next week. So until then, have a great day.